Hello, everyone. I wanted to do a brief video just giving you an overview of part 4 of the course. We have now finished part 3 on Plato and Landsberg. You'll be concentrating on your part 3 essay. I made a video on that earlier tonight, and I hope that it helps. In any case, we're moving on to part 4 of the course, reading Charles Hartshorne's Time, Death, and Eternal Life, paired with Hans Jonas, our old friend, his essay, Immortality and the Modern Temper. Let's see where we are in the course. I do think that the course has a certain logic to it, certain progression, not in any sort of strict way. We sort of move from topic to topic, but I think that it sort of builds on itself, and we build up a kind of a common reading background. We all do, and a common vocabulary about philosophical vocabulary about death. And in any case, I mean the course to have something of a logical progression. Let's see where we've been. We started out in part 1, Epicureanism and its puzzles, and I don't need to explain that to you anymore. I mean, you know what Epicureanism is with regard to death, and you know what the puzzles are. Very tightly focused sort of thing about, some of the things that emerge from the Epicurean view that death is the total privation of awareness, that is nothing to us. We opened things up somewhat, talking about the related concept of mortality with Hans Jonas's Burden and Blessing of Mortality and Glenn Gray's essay on existentialism. But more relevantly to part 4 of the course, in part 3, we looked at the sort of anti-Epicurean philosophers, Plato and Landsberg, and their views of death and their views of immortality. And what we got from both of them in different ways was what I would say full-blown views of immortality. That is, and one of the things I told you about reading Epicurus and sort of grasping his theory of death is that to understand what Epicurus is getting at, you have to put aside any notion that death is a transition. For Epicurus, death is not a transition. Death is a limit, an absolute limit. But with Plato and Landsberg, we recover that notion of death as being a transition from one form of existence or one form of being to another. And both of them view the transition to this other form of being as a transition to really what can be called in the full sense an afterlife. That is, a life of the spirit or the life of the mind or life of the soul, insofar as it's a culmination and a kind of a realization, to put it in Landsberg's terms, of the person in an afterlife where something is promised there. But in any case, it's a full-blown notion of immortality. Plato, this notion that the soul is liberated from the body and can finally know truth. Of course, Landsberg's Christianity, where the soul or the person realizes themselves in the fullest way in an afterlife. I'm emphasizing that because I've called part 4 of the course After Immortality, the Book of Life, and that for 2 reasons. The more obvious reason is the Book of Life thing, as you'll see both Hartshorne and Landsberg, crazy about Landsberg, both Hartshorne and Jonas employ the metaphor of the Book of Life in their conception of an existence beyond death. But the after immortality thing is, I think you'll see what I mean when you've read both of them, but just to give you a sense of it, well, what we get from these 2 writers is not a full-blown notion of immortality. It is a much reduced, much more moderate, much less, I don't know what you would call it, a view of the afterlife that is not a life in any way that we would recognize it, but a continuing form of existence. And the existence is, the metaphor is used, again, of the book, but much more moderate, maybe second best, is what I said in the introductory overview video for the course as a whole. not a vision of an afterlife in which we continue to have experiences, continue to form bonds or have knowledge or reach some kind of self-actualization, but a much more reduced sense of it. So you might say an anti-Epicureanism, but a much less extravagant or full-blown anti-Epicureanism. We exist for these two authors in some form after death, but in a much reduced way, you might say. Not as ghosts or as, but you'll see what I mean. They're two very good examples, I would say, of two modern philosophers. Modern, in the case of Hartshorne, well, both of them religiously minded, Jonas and Hartshorne, but neither of whom would subscribe to our ordinary notions of an afterlife, of a heaven or hell, or any religious conception that I can think of. So that's kind of what I'm getting at. Obviously, the details matter, but that's my explanation of that after immortality thing, and why I'm following up part 3 of the course with these two readings. You'll eventually be asked whether this is enough for you, or whether you prefer these more moderate, less extravagant, or less ambitious notions of the afterlife or not, over compared to the more ambitious ones at part 3.